Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture, I'm going to be taking a look at going from a state of having no international trade, a country being completely self-sufficient in what the market looks like. Then we're going to open up the market to international trade, and we're going to take a look at how that impacts the importing nation versus how that looks for the exporting nation of that particular product that's now subject to international trade. So here we start with the importing nation. We have domestic demand, downward sloping, domestic supply, upward sloping for whatever this product happens to be, and where they intersect one another, we're going to have the equilibrium price, that's P in the domestic marketplace, and the equilibrium quantity QE. As we know from previously, the area of consumer surplus or consumer surplus is the area above price but below the demand curve. So the area bounded by this dotted line here and the demand curve. Producer surplus is the area bounded by price, so the domestic price, so this dotted line here, and above the supply curve. So bounded by the supply curve here, so we have this green area that's producer surplus, and we have this purplish area which is consumer surplus. So the only way international trade is actually going to occur here for an importing nation is if the imported goods going to be cheaper than if it was produced domestically. So we're going to have a product being imported into this nation because of the fact that its price is that much cheaper than it is in the domestic market. So there's the price in the world. We follow that till we hit the domestic supply curve. And this tells me how much will be produced by domestic suppliers of this product. If we continue along the world price until we hit the domestic demand, that tells me what the quantity demanded is in the domestic market. So at that world price, the quantity demanded domestically is greater than the quantity supplied domestically. So this shortage will be met by imports from another nation. So what we want to know is, how is this all of a sudden opening the world up, opening your market to imports, how that's going to impact the importing nation's equilibrium. So now we can see we have that lower world price here, and as we hopefully recall, that consumers are generally better off when prices are lower, and that producers are better off when prices are higher. So we see that the price is falling from the domestic price to the world price. That means consumers are going to be better off and producers are going to be worse off. So we have the producer surplus shift, the letters there, PS, moving, so that gives you an indication of what's going to be changing. So that new purple area that just came in, that is new consumer surplus that is being created by opening up this particular market. A portion of it used to be producer surplus, this used to be producer surplus, and this used to be producer surplus, but it's been converted to consumer surplus by the lower price. Also, we can explain what this particular triangle is. This triangle is the extra consumption that occurs because of the lower world price and imports coming in. Remember, when we were in a domestic market equilibrium, we had QE being produced and consumed. Now, QD is greater than that. So this is consumer surplus that's created by new consumption of that imported product. And we could take a look at this area here, this triangle on the left-hand side. This has to do with the fact that you're able to buy imported goods more cheaply than you were to purchase them when they were purchased domestically. So you're still consuming these. This difference between the domestic supply, quantity supplied, and the original equilibrium, that is the amount of production that's supplanted by import. So the production of supplanted import production accounts for this area of consumer surplus. So again, we can verify this by saying, well, I remember what the definition of consumer surplus is. It's the area bounded by the price, so we're going to be at the world price, and the demand curve. So that gives me this entire large purple triangle. And if we go back to the definition of what producer surplus is the area below price and above the supply curve. So the producer surplus here is this region, P world, until we hit the domestic supply, and that gives us the area of producer surplus. So now that we know what these are, we can go to a point and say, you know what, we've allowed free trade, we don't want that to occur, we're going to ban imports. So we're just going to go back to our original situation, and I'm going to move out those forms there. So we could take a look at what they are. So let's take a look at the triangles here. Remember, these were created consumer surplus. So this is going to be consumer surplus negative, and it is dead weight because neither one of these exist anymore. They were created when international trade was allowed and the cheaper import was allowed to flow into the economy. But now that we've reversed that, we can take those two items out. Since they were created, now they are being destroyed, so they are dead weight loss. And by the color purple that I have here, we know that that used to be consumer surplus. So now all we have to be concerned with is this area in here. So we have a rectangle and a triangle. And they represent gains to producer surplus and to losses in consumer surplus. So this used to be consumer surplus, but gets converted to producer surplus. And because it's a conversion, it's a wealth transfer, it's not a dead weight loss. Now we can take the same exact look, except take it from the perspective of the exporting nation. And for it to be an exporting nation, there has to be international trade, and the world price has to be greater than the domestic price because you wouldn't want to export something unless you can make a profit doing it. So it's going to have to be at a higher price than your domestic market. So let's say the world price is there. We follow that till we hit domestic demand and go straight down. And that tells me at that new world price, this is the quantity demanded in the domestic market. We keep following that world price until we hit the domestic supply, and that tells me what the quantity supplied is in the domestic market. So at that world price, the quantity supplied domestically is greater than the quantity demanded domestically. So those additional units, those surplus units, will be exported out of this particular country. So what we want to know now is how is this going to impact consumers and producers? So with the world price being higher, and that being the price in this domestic marketplace, consumers are going to be made worse off and producers are going to be made better off. So if we take a look at this, we can shade the areas in of green, and since that's producer surplus, that is all now producer surplus. Why? Because what is the dimension of the definition of producer surplus? It's the area bounded by the price and the supply curve. So we have this entire green area here. And for consumer surplus, it's the area above the price but below the demand curve. So we have that purple section in here. So realize that this area and this area in here used to be consumer surplus, but now get converted to producer surplus. And this is surplus that did not exist before this particular country started exporting those particular products. So this is created producer surplus, and these two are transferred. So if we move those pieces out of the way, we can see that these two triangles in this area are dead weight loss. They no longer exist. There is nothing there. Once we get to the point where we, for example, ban exports, so we're banning exports, so the domestic price is what we're going to see. So these two triangles that were in this area here are now going to be producer surplus that's lost, and not only lost, it's destroyed. It does not exist anymore, therefore it is dead weight loss. And then if we take a look at the remaining green areas, we have this square here and this triangle here. So they were under world trade and the export of this good, they were producer surplus, so they are a decrease in producer surplus and the increasing consumer surplus, so they are transferring. The wealth is being transferred from producers to consumers. Therefore, there is no deadweight loss associated with this particular situation.